When I was 13, if somebody asked me what my favorite game was, I probably would have scrambled disinterestedly to name a first-person shooter that I'd often play with my friends at the time. Probably Call of Duty 2 or Halo 2. I enjoyed video games, I played them a lot, but I didn't really consider them anything other than frivolous social entertainment. I rarely played anything single-player, and I was too busy playing sports in my free time to really get invested into anything that required commitment. But in 2007, that all changed. This was the year just after the launch of two new major consoles that would go on to be the longest-running console generation in history. New titles like Halo 3 and Gears of War are pushing graphical boundaries you never thought possible. It's an optimistic, exciting time for video games, but also lacking something really thoughtful or groundbreaking. A high mark in creativity for the medium. Then came this trailer. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It was uncompromisingly visceral and unique. A fallen city underwater, men in giant armored diving suits with drills for arms, shooting bees out of your hands. And while this trailer would turn out to be far from the visual reality of the game it was showcasing, it ended up being accurate to its creative reality. This game, Bioshock, was a shock to my system so thorough that it changed my belief and interest in the entire medium of video games forever. After I played Bioshock, I knew this was something special and something that I would still be interested in years and years later. Not only is Bioshock a game worthy of historical praise and veneration, but it's one of a handful of games that means something to me personally, as it released in my formative years of my early teens. I have extremely vivid memories of first seeing this game played at a community gamer lounge at the one console in the back and just being entranced by it. I remember getting the game on my birthday and playing through half the game in one sitting and then replaying it over and over again multiple times a year throughout high school. At first I fell in love with the unique gameplay systems, but as I got older, I came to realize that those are really the least remarkable things about the game. Bioshock, I'd argue, has the best realized world of any game that I've ever played. Everything from the logical, consistent layout of the city and its areas itself, the stunning art direction complete with both period-accurate Art Deco styling and wild, exotic visuals and motifs, and the complicated, nuanced backstory of the city's growth and then fall. I'm going to try to separate my personal connection to this game as much as possible, but I decided that it needed to be mentioned just in case I ever gloss over any serious flaws that any of you might consider more important. I love this game. It's genuinely one of my favorites of all time, but as I've grown older, and I've played other games in the genre like its spiritual predecessor from the same developer, System Shock 2, I no longer consider it the untouchable, life-changing masterpiece that my teenage self did. Most notably, it's Bioshock's combat mechanics and RPG elements that don't agree with me as much as they used to. Bioshock is a difficult game to box into any particular genre. It's a first-person shooter. It's a narrative-driven exploration game. It's a survival horror game. It's an immersive sim with prodigious optional tools at your disposal, and it's got magical powers fired from your hand. It defies genre conventions, and that's one of its greatest strengths and one of its greatest weaknesses, because it really doesn't do any one genre justice. It's an okay shooter, it's an okay survival horror game, and it has very light RPG elements instead of more traditional RPG stat trees and progression. The shooting is fine, I guess. For the time, it's not terribly out of sync, but it's aged so badly. When the starting pistol is the most satisfying weapon in the game, you know something has gone terribly wrong. The shotgun and the machine gun both feel spongy and unresponsive with massive, imprecise crosshairs that don't allow for graceful targeting. The chemical thrower and the grenade launcher are too specialized to use consistently, and the crossbow breaks the economy of the game with its reusable bolts and absurd damage. The pistol and the crossbow are the only weapons in the game with crosshairs precise enough to get headshots. The shotgun is a shotgun, so that makes sense, but the machine gun sprays in a huge cone of fire with almost no feedback or kick. Most of the weapons don't actually feel like there's any projectiles at all. It's like you're pointing and clicking invisible teleporting bullets into the splicers. So the shooting at its core mechanics isn't very good, but neither was System Shock 2's, and the combat in that game remains enduringly satisfying. That's because System Shock 2 didn't need good mechanics. It had complex stat trees and progression to make up for it. Because Bioshock, unlike its spiritual predecessor System Shock 2, is a first-person shooter with RPG elements, instead of a traditionally systemized first-person RPG, It robs the player the ability to develop any kind of unique playstyle systemically. There's no statistics that affect accuracy, damage, or proficiency with weapon types outside of very obvious upgrades doled out over the course of the game. And while it's nice that this allows the player more options to experiment with, it does not allow the player to create an indelible proficiency with any specific weapon in the game. By the end game, all the weapons in Plasmids bleed together into an indistinguishable pool of tepid usefulness. No weapon is really any more useful than the other. System Shock 2 is much more particular in its systems. You can't even wield whole weapon types without enough skill points in their requisite tree. And while this does create some downsides, it makes absolutely no sense that you need rank 4 in exotic weapons to be able to hit people over the head with a glowing stick. It also meant that the player could get to be the best at 1 or 2 specific weapon types. If you reach max rank in the standard weapons skill tree, then those standard weapons are supremely effective all the way through the entire game. Bioshock only allows you to get kind of good with all the weapons instead of being the best with only a couple of them. In giving the player access to all weapons, they've mitigated all their usefulness and total power. The same goes for Plasmids, whose usefulness only extends to side abilities instead of a separate tree with enough progression to establish a whole playstyle of their own like System Shock 2's Psi abilities. Bioshock's Plasmids, although much more visually and thematically successful than System Shock 2's Psi abilities, are a severely cut down, simplified version. In System Shock 2, you could build a character entirely around Psi abilities and make it through the whole game that way. Bioshock's Plasmids only serve as a complement to your primary firearms. The 3 primary offensive Plasmids, Electro Bolt, Incinerate, and Winter's Blast, are by a ridiculous margin the most useful Plasmids in the game. The rest are too situational in their uses to be often useful. Cyclone Trap in particular is borderline useless as it's made redundant by multiple types of superior trap ammo on the grenade launcher and the crossbow. Hypnotize Big Daddy is useful, but I don't understand why it's not just Hypnotize in general so that it can be used more often. Probably so that it wouldn't overlap with Enrage, even though it kinda already does. There's usually only 3 Big Daddies on a level max, so I almost never use it. Security Bullseye might as well be worthless as well, since you could just hack a camera and get the same effect. What happened to all the powers that gave you stat boosts and guarded against environmental effects? It's true that offensively, Bioshock has more powers since System Shock 2 only offered cytokinesis, but it's at the cost of losing everything else from the Psi tree, everything that made the Psi tree deep and rewarding. The effectiveness of Plasmids also takes a huge nosedive in the last third of the game when the basic melee splicer becomes electrified, nullifying Electro Bolt to the point of making it a liability. Stunning a charging melee splicer is supposed to be the whole point of the Plasmid, and now they just absorb it like they're fucking X-Men. If you just spend all your Atom fully upgrading Electro Bolt expecting it to actually be useful, it's pretty disappointing. Incinerate suffers a similar fate, although not as obvious. Its damage, even when fully upgraded, is nerfed to the point where I'm pretty sure giving them a hug would deplete their health faster. This completely arbitrary spike in enemy health and adoption of these resistances makes the combat a relentless slog in the last third of the game. You've already got all the weapons, you've already got all the Plasmids, and both of those feel like they just got slapped back to level 0, except there's nowhere to go up from there. The combat's not great for the first 2/3 of the game either, but you're so overwhelmed by all the exploration and the story and the constant stream of new guns and Plasmids and upgrades that it never becomes so obvious. The last third is just a chore, and that makes the arbitrary roadblocks of story progression incredibly obvious and frustrating. The last chunk of the game is notoriously bad where you become a quote-unquote Big Daddy, so I'm just gonna skim over it. It's the worst part of the game by far. The combat has already become much less interesting and overstayed its welcome, so what does Bioshock think will alleviate that? Horde mode in a linear tunnel followed by a little sister moving as slowly as she can possibly shuffle while repeating the same 2 lines about you being too slow until you just want to turn the game off and never play it again.
Time to go, Mr. B. Hurry, Mr. B. Don't be slow, Mr. B. Hurry, hurry, Mr. B. Hurry, hurry, Mr. Bubbles. Hurry,
Child, well,
hurry, Mr. B.
look.
Time to go, Mr. B. No time to waste. Don't be a slowpoke, Mr. B. Angels don't wait for slowpokes. Hurry, Mr. B.
This is not playing as a Big Daddy, this is playing as Jack with a fishbowl on your head, in the most linear level in the entire Bioshock series. It takes a hatchet to the established rules of Big Daddies as well. Over and over again, you'll hear characters mention how the transformation is a one-way street. It's horrible. The process essentially lobotomizes them, enslaving them to this one purpose forever. But Jack is apparently able to take off the helmet for the final boss fight and then everything's fine. I had to look this up if there's any kind of explanation at all for this ridiculous plot hole, and the game's wiki claims that the suit was never grafted to him so he never became a real Big Daddy. I never heard that mentioned anywhere in the game at all. Playing as this nerfed, clunky version of a Big Daddy is terrible, but fighting them is the one area of Bioshock's combat that really shines. The vast majority are totally optional, but are the only way to get at them, which is the currency needed to upgrade your plasmids and tonics. Fighting Big Daddies requires preparation and a greater mastery of Bioshock's systems that really make all of its options, from hacking turrets to setting traps and using special ammo types, actually feel useful and satisfying to string together. The balance gets mitigated towards the endgame once you have jacked up weapons like incendiary bolts with a crossbow, but in the early game, fights with Big Daddies shine bright and represent Bioshock's combat at their absolute peak. There's 2 to 3 on each level to find, and it helps to keep your resources strained when the game can be really generous with the amount of ammo and money you'll find lying around. I wish Bioshock systems worked this well all the time, but they demonstrably don't. So many of its mechanics, like hacking, become ridiculously tedious, and inventory management becomes non-existent towards the end of the game with an annoyingly small cap on ammo, and even your currency. So many rooms you'll walk into, realize that you're full on ammo and money, and then just walk out without being able to pick up anything. Speaking as a serial looter and an ammo hoarder, it's my kryptonite. I genuinely don't understand why Bioshock gives you such a small limit on the amount of ammo or money you can pick up, when it has such a generous supply of both to give you. It hurts exploration and makes it feel pointless when it goes to such incredible effort to make exploration satisfying visually. I want to reiterate that Bioshock is a game that I genuinely do love and consider one of my favorites of all time, but I don't love the combat, or its systems. They are the aspects of this game that I appreciate the least. I know that's contentious. I know people hold this in high regard, but it falls apart under comparisons with System Shock 2, a game identical in structure, but massively superior in its uncompromising systems. So why is Bioshock such a revered game if its gameplay structure is generally pretty lackluster? Bioshock's greatest strength lies in its level design. It is still unparalleled among the entire Shock series, Bioshock 2 and Infinite included. Even though the combat takes a pretty steep nosedive in the last third of the game, the level design is consistent with the rest of the game. Consistently gorgeous and packed with optional areas and secrets. What really distinguishes Bioshock's level design from the other games in the series is its commitment to naturalistic and realistic environments. They don't feel like video game levels, they feel like real places, with entire areas lacking any gameplay purpose at all, other than to establish the setting. This is one of the few games that feels like they designed the world first and then designed a game around it second, and that's very much to Bioshock's benefit. Its atmosphere and setting are thoroughly unbreakably convincing in a way that very few of its peers can attest to. It even goes a step beyond that, theming each of its levels around a specific purpose in Rapture, from the industrial fisheries of Neptune's bounty to the residential opulence of Olympus Heights to the Art Deco neon-drenched shopping district of Fort Frolic. Each level is so distinct and so expertly designed that it stands as the high watermark of level design that the series was unfortunately never able to match again. And the game is designed in a way to complement its open areas with open-ended multi-part goals that encourage the player to visit every square inch of this lovingly crafted environment. Many others have made the criticism that this is bad pacing, when Steinman blocks the obvious path of progress with a pile of rubble, or Andrew Ryan kills the trees in Arcadia, requiring a lengthy crafting hunt to restore the oxygen. Arbitrary roadblocks for sure, but Bioshock is at its best when you are exploring the city on your own pace. You need something to push you so that you don't miss all these secrets and audio logs and the gorgeous architecture and the wonderfully creepy mood and atmosphere. It's just great. The combat doesn't always work, and it may not always be rewarding for resources, but that's ultimately okay, because it's never been the point of Shock games. I know it sounds weird to say that gameplay isn't the point of a game, but Bioshock is one of the rare few games where it obviously isn't the focus. It's these other qualities that make the series so memorable and engaging. The world design, the environmental storytelling, the atmosphere, and the art style transcend its own mechanical flaws. Bioshock's setting, the underwater city of Rapture, is simultaneously one of gaming's most unique and memorable settings, and also one of its most believable and well-constructed. How does a massively populated underwater city whose citizens have developed superpowers go completely unnoticed by the surface and still be believable? Bioshock's world is one where almost every detail is explained thoroughly and most uniquely, charismatically. The default method to deliver exposition about video game settings is through usually dry, studious text logs or lifelessly acted, laborious voice diaries. Bioshock delivers background exposition better than any other game that I've ever played. It wraps its important world-building details in character and story.
To build a city at the bottom of the sea, insanity. But where else could we be free from the clutching hand of the parasites? Where else could we build an economy that they would not try to control, a society that they would not try to destroy? It was not impossible to build Rapture at the bottom of the sea. It was impossible to build it anywhere else.
Its audio logs feature characters with more depth than most cinematic games with a more forward and more integral story. Many of these background characters have full-blown character arcs, all with gripping and believable performances to cement them as real people and Rapture as a real place. There's no awkward cutscenes or forced side characters to explain all this to you. It's left totally optional, and it's excellently acted and written audio logs scattered around Rapture. In Rapture, all roads lead to Andrew Ryan, the city's founder and creator. Andrew Ryan is a villain with a vision and a philosophy, and not one of the dozens of fake, pretentious philosophy-spouting villains that have sprung up in games over the past few years, but a man with a genuine, unstoppable conviction and will to bring this vision to life. Principally, Andrew Ryan is a figurehead for Objectivism, a school of thought theorized by Ayn Rand that values an individual's rights totally and absolutely. Andrew Ryan's experiences in Russia and the United States bred a deep resentment and contempt for the dominant socio-economic structures of the world of communism and capitalism with specific social welfare programs. In one audio log, Ryan claims that while living in the United States, he decided to burn his own forest down instead of letting the government nationalize it and turn it into a public park. His ideology is one that carries zero room for compromise. In response, Rapture was created, a vast underwater utopia built for the purest expression of rational egoism. Rapture is a city with no government regulation, with no ethical or moral restraints put on artists or scientists. At first, it really did work. Rapture is decades ahead of the surface world in its technology due to this world-class scientific community being fully untethered in their pursuits. But by stripping away any kind of moral or ethical responsibility, the advancements in technology and biology come at a terrible cost. The discovery that led to Rapture's greatest heights and then its downfall is Adam, a genetic material extracted from sea slugs on the ocean floor. With it, Rapture was able to fundamentally rewrite genetics and created Plasmids, the superpowers you are given throughout the game. Plasmids became the most popular and demanded commodity in all of Rapture, and the city was unable to supply the wants of its buyers as Adam becomes extremely addictive over time. So in response, the Little Sisters were created after discovering that if the slugs were embedded in a human subject's stomach, the yield of Adam would be 20 to 30 times higher. In the creation of the Little Sisters, it's clear that a moral line was crossed in listening to the audio diaries of Tenenbaum and Andrew Ryan.
The children, with their very long needles, their tuneless songs, their ghastly errands, their ghoulish Frankenstein fathers. But we've all placed our hand on the great chain of endeavor. My hand is on it. Fontaine's is on it. We all pull it and are pulled by it. Yes, these children are an abomination. But it is not my hand alone on the chain that created them. No. Their little fingers were right there, next to mine.
Both are disgusted in a guttural, primal way over what was done to the girls. The Little Sisters are grotesque, physically and morally. Their creation came about by the businessman Frank Fontaine exploiting Rapture's top-heavy economic structure and founding the Little Sisters Orphanage, a front to freely experiment and dump away those unused orphan girls of the city. You feel it in your gut over how wrong the creation of these creatures are. The creation of atoms seemed like it was Ryan's dream, the crowning achievement of a society with no barriers to what they could accomplish with drive and hard work. But the discovery of atoms signals the beginning of the end for Rapture, as its overwhelmingly addictive nature leads to a desperate power struggle between the warring factions in the city, igniting a civil war and the fall of Andrew Ryan's beliefs and ideology. Because of Ryan's uncompromising belief in the free market and his zero-tolerance policy for government regulation, Atom exploded in popularity to a point where its demand quickly got out of control. Fontaine Futuristics, the company responsible for plasmid production, resorted to the creation of the Little Sisters to meet the rapidly growing demand. Fontaine's rise to power initially demonstrated Ryan's commitment to principle, as he swats away the notion of one of Fontaine's competitors for himself to get involved and stifle Fontaine's increasing market share.
Gregory, don't come whining to me about market forces, and don't expect me to punish citizens for showing a little initiative. If you don't like what Fontaine is doing, well, I suggest you find a way to offer a better product.
But as Fontaine's power increased to a level that began to diminish even Ryan's, he began to compromise on principles he founded the entire city on.
Something must be done about Fontaine. While I was buying buildings and fish futures, he was cornering the market on genotypes and nucleotide sequences. Rapture is transforming before my eyes. The great chain is pulling away from me. Perhaps it's time to give it a tug.
Ryan suspects Fontaine of being involved in numerous criminal activities, including smuggling contraband from the surface. After engaging in fruitless, extensive investigations into Fontaine's businesses, he eventually got what he wanted when Fontaine is killed in a fiery shootout with Ryan's security forces. But Ryan's obsession with Fontaine went beyond his corporeal body. After Fontaine's death, he nationalizes Fontaine's business, Fontaine Futuristics, which many rightfully saw as a betrayal of Rapture's founding principles. Remember, this is the same man who burned down his own forest instead of letting it become a piece of public property. It only gets worse from there. Rising from Fontaine's ashes was a thorn in Ryan's side even more troublesome: Atlas, the smooth-talking, charismatic champion of the poor. Even though Fontaine's influence was vast, he was still seen as a thug in Rapture's general populace. Atlas capitalizes on the top-heavy socio-economic structure of Rapture and rides it for all it's worth. He gathers supporters from Fontaine's houses from the poor. He protests against Ryan's nationalization of Fontaine Futuristics, and ignites the civil war that would eventually lead to Rapture's ultimate downfall. Ryan was unable to handle the pressure. Because of both Fontaine and then Atlas's growing power and the increasing distrust of his own friends and supporters, he gradually compromises every single one of Rapture's founding principles in an effort to stymie their influence. He orders his chief of security to assassinate an artist for criticizing him, legislates the death penalty for those caught smuggling, and his final act before you as the player arrive, betray the most essential, fundamental principle of his ineffable ideology: the basic free will of Rapture's citizens.
Dr. Suchong, frankly, I'm shocked by your proposal. If we were to modify the structure of our commercial plasmid line as you propose, to have them make the user vulnerable to mental suggestion through pheromones, would we not be able to effectively control the actions of the citizens of Rapture? Free will is the cornerstone of this city. The thought of sacrificing it is abhorrent. However, we are indeed in a time of war. If Atlas and his bandits have their way, will they not turn us into slaves? And what will become of free will then? Desperate times call for desperate measures.
Fearing defeat in the Civil War, Ryan agrees to one of Suchong's suggestions to break the stalemate, altering the plasmid production line with pheromones that would leave those who use them susceptible to mind control. Andrew Ryan isn't a great villain because of his ideology. Andrew Ryan is a great villain because he was too weak to uphold the principles of his ideology when the pressure was on. Objectivism doesn't fail. Ryan does. He's portrayed with incredible detail and nuance. He struggles so severely to uphold the things he believes in, but ultimately lashes out and compromises instead. Of course, that's exactly why Objectivism isn't a realistically applicable economic philosophy, because it assumes that human beings are virtuous and principled by nature instead of the petty, unpredictable, and fundamentally greedy and selfish beings that we truly are. Rapture and Ryan are essentially a critique of Objectivism. Not exactly analysis, weighing the benefits and drawbacks with nuance, but a pretty staunch, hardline criticism of its worth. Why free market, unregulated capitalism, why completely unrestricted scientific and artistic values fall apart under their own ambition. Like all hardline, grandiose philosophy, Objectivism sounds wonderful in theory. Theorized by Ayn Rand, it's a system where hard work is valued above all else, where competing business interests will naturally solve market balance without heavy-handed government regulation, where science is free to advance mankind without ethical restraints, and where artists are free to create whatever their hearts desire, regardless of how it might negatively affect society. Sounds like a paradise, right? It sounds like a paradise for everyone except the working class. As Frank Fontaine puts it, somebody's gotta scrub the toilets.
These sad saps. They come to Rapture thinking they're gonna be captains of industry. But they all forget that somebody's gotta scrub the toilets. What an angle they gave me. I hand these mugs a cot and a bowl of soup, and they give me their lives. Who needs an army when I got Fontaine's Home for the Poor?
Not everyone gets to wear the crown, and those at the top will do everything in their power to ensure that they get to keep wearing that crown, regardless of how unfair things are for everybody under them. Unregulated capitalism leads to monopolies, the antithesis of market balance. It leads to unethical treatment of workers who have no recourse for unfair employer practices. Wages become lower as employers gain more power. Housing and commodities become more expensive as the markets consolidate and squeeze the working class even further. As the working class struggles to survive in a laissez-faire market system, criminal markets thrive as an alternative to the unregulated market control big business has. This leads to violence and even further disruption of the markets. A no-compromises free market system without government regulation is bound to collapse under its own weight. It is a system designed from the ground up to benefit the wealthy and the fortunate disproportionately, and squashes the opportunities of the less fortunate to reach the same heights. It's why the vast majority of modern societies combine a mixture of social services and programs and segmented capitalist markets. Hardline libertarians may have a point when they decry governmental overreach such as warrantless NSA spying, but you'll never hear a libertarian content if their house burns down because there's no fire department. Rapture is an exaggerated science fiction version of an objectivist paradise gone wrong, but it does have bite in its detailing of the faults of a system that modern libertarians have been stealth championing for decades. Anyone who claims that Bioshock doesn't have anything to say about objectivism is being mostly untruthful. Anything really thoughtful and analytical, that's more debatable, but it clearly does take a stance on the philosophy with the portrayal of its world. Complicated politics aside, Bioshock adds a ton of personality and believability to its world through its audio logs and the thoroughly developed characters who left them. Characters like Diane McClintock paint a sympathetic portrayal of how an unambitious normal person experiences Rapture, and characters like McDonough and Sullivan give a much weightier context to Ryan's downfall. Sullivan is my absolute favorite character in the game, who experiences a genuine character arc throughout Rapture's rise and fall, and gives some much-needed humanity to the never-ending tragedy. His audio logs are scattered throughout the game, relatively chronologically, with the first being his recording of the torture of a man in Neptune's bounty on Ryan's orders.
Mr. Ryan asked me personally to make this clear to you. You give us Fontaine, and this whole filthy ring of his, and you'll be knocking back pints up at the Fighting McDonough's. But if you prefer to play the mule, we'll treat you like a mule. Give him a taste, Patrick. What's that? Change of heart, Timmy? Timmy! Ready to talk now?
Go on, Sullivan. Go on and do your dirty. Whatever Ryan thinks he can do to me, Fontaine can do double!
Sullivan is Ryan's chief of security, and he has a ruthless loyalty for the man. He electrocutes Fontaine's men with zero remorse. But But as Ryan's principles begin to crumble, he muses in audio diaries about his orders. He threatens to hand in his badge when Ryan instigates capital punishment for smuggling, but the breaking point is when Ryan orders him to assassinate Anna Culpepper, an artist who committed the unspeakable crime of criticizing Ryan publicly.
I just got the word to put the bump on Anna Culpepper. This isn't some gangster or hard-nosed political operative. We're talking about a dizzy twist what wrote a song or two that got under Ryan's wig.
He eventually goes through with it and leaves a deeply disturbed message afterwards, and it's implied that he might have even committed suicide.
When it was done with Culpepper, I left her as she was in the bathroom. I seen she had a blanket half knitted by her bed. It was nice, you know, black and red, real pretty. So I took it, so I could, you know, have somebody finish it, so it could be of use to someone. It just didn't seem right to leave it lying there, all by itself.
For a character who is most likely already dead and gone, that's some really clever and effective storytelling. They're able to do so much with performance and location that they didn't have in substantial screen time or writing. The other standout off-screen character is McDonough, one of Ryan's real friends on the city council that eventually turns on him as the city begins to fall. McDonough is more concerned with the fate of the city as a whole, and leaves a scathing audio diary after Ryan's nationalization of Fontaine Futuristics. He resigns from the city council immediately, and as the Civil War drew on and became more and more deadly, decides that Ryan has to die for Rapture to survive. He's unsuccessful, and unlike Sullivan, this is not ambiguous. His body is one of those impaled on the spike outside Ryan's office with a final message.
I never killed a man, let alone a mate. But this is what things come to. I don't know if killing Mr. Ryan will stop the war, but I know it won't stop while that man breathes. I love Mr. Ryan, but I love Rapture. If I have to kill one to save the other, so be it.
I've never really seen another game put this much effort into these types of characters. They're so incredibly easy to miss that I bet the vast majority of players never pay enough attention to comprehend more than a few of these throughout its runtime. Functionally, an audiolog's objective is to provide context, and they do that in spades, but Bioshock's audiolog's storytelling ends up being their defining feature. It's a storytelling method that ends up being much more effective than the actual linear story the game is interested in telling. Personally, the story of Ryan and Rapture has always been the most unique and the most dominant part of Bioshock's overarching narrative to me. Everything is tied into it, so much so that by the end of the player's journey as Jack, a bystander who enters Rapture by surviving a plane crash near the entrance to the city, ends up feeling more like an epilogue to the grand rise and fall of the greatest feat of engineering the world has ever known. The big twist about 2/3 of the way through the game confirms this even more. I think it's indisputably one of gaming's all-time greatest plot twists and narrative achievements because it works on so many levels. The first is the shock of the twist itself. It's not a sudden realization done through a huge exposition dump. It's slowly teased out and then ultimately revealed through visuals and through audio logs. Once Ryan figures out you work for Atlas, it's not long before he starts teasing you with hints about your true identity.
A man builds a city at the bottom of the sea. That's a marvel. Another man happens to be on a plane that crash lands on the same city in the middle of the ocean. Why, that sounds more like a miracle.
Then there's this room. This is Bioshock's grand reveal of Jack's true identity. The scene with Ryan in his office later on is just a more explicit confirmation of many of the things we can already ascertain from this room. But there is enough information on this desk to put the entire picture together. You are not just a hapless bystander thrown into Rapture out of a necessity to survive. As Ryan mentions, that sounds more like a miracle. Jack is tied into Atlas and Ryan's war more directly than anybody anticipated at the start of the game. The second level is the intricacy and layers and how far back this twist goes. Back in Fort Frolic, there's a room with the dead body and ghost of Jasmine Jolene, an exotic dancer and, as the audio log confirms, Ryan's mistress. She became pregnant and sold the fetus to Frank Fontaine through Tenenbaum because she needed the money. As Sullivan mentions in an earlier audio log, the bathyspheres and even vita chambers are coded to Ryan's genetic code, so that only people related to Ryan can use them. But you've been using them for the entire game. That fetus sold to Fontaine was you. Fontaine planned to use this child as a backup plan in his war with Ryan, since anyone with Ryan's genetic code would be able to access anywhere in the city freely could be invaluable. He used the opportunity to develop plasmid technology even further and created Jack as a genetically engineered slave that would grow up on the surface and then be called back if Fontaine ever needed him. The flashes of memories you see in the game are a fabrication, implanted to convince Jack that he's a real person with real memories outside of Rapture. And of course the "would you kindly" line being a veiled command phrase. Atlas's reveal as Fontaine in disguise and the death of Andrew Ryan. It's not just a twist for the sole sake of it being shocking. It's one that reframes everything in your journey up until that point and gives a whole new context to your character. The final level is that it also functions as a sort of meta-commentary on the player's agency in a linear story. This is something that Ken Levine, Bioshock's creative director, is very interested in and has based his entire new project on, so this isn't something I'm pulling from nowhere. You as the player don't have any choice but to follow Fontaine's orders. Not because the game literally seizes control away from you, but because you aren't presented with an alternative. Bioshock Infinite takes this commentary and takes it much further, but Bioshock's twist does also work as light meta-commentary about the nature of the medium. Bioshock mixes its messages a little too much for this level of the twist to have any kind of value, though. This is the same game where binary player choice is presented as this clever moral dilemma that will affect the ending, but it just completely falls flat. Bioshock's most iconic imagery, the little sister and the Big Daddy, gives way to its moral choice system. After defeating the Big Daddy, you have the choice to harvest the atom inside the little sister or rescue her. Harvesting gives you 160 atom for each little sister, while rescuing gives you 80. What the game doesn't tell you is that every 3 little sisters that are rescued, you are rewarded with a gift of 200 atom plus tonics. So if we break down the amount into threes, harvesting 3 little sisters will reward you with 480 atom, and rescuing 3 little sisters plus the gift will reward you with 440 atom, plus a bunch of free tonics and other items. What was supposed to be a moral dilemma about the exploitation of children for your own purposes or being strong enough to pass on the temptations of corrupted power is totally and completely undercut by its unbalanced economy. The only way this moral choice system works is on a deeper level, and if you think about it thematically instead of pragmatically. Are you a man or a slave? It's the question that Andrew Ryan asks you right before his death. A man chooses, a slave obeys. To harvest the little sisters is to obey not only Atlas, but your own will to survive. To rescue the little sisters is a choice unexpected of you, to break the great chain of Rapture and disregard its temptations. So by the time you do reach the end of the game with a shockingly unremarkable final boss fight against a spliced up version of Fontaine, it gives you one of 2 endings based on how the little sisters were treated. If you harvest even 2 little sisters, then you receive the bad ending. Full stop. Using the power of Rapture and its forces, you decide to go to the surface and conquer the world over ominous music. It's so stupid that I can't even hate it. It's just comedy gold, the leap of logic the game takes from harvesting 2 little sisters to see Hitler. The good ending is just as bad, but in the opposite direction. Jack leaves Rapture with nothing but the little sisters and makes sure to give them full lives, going to college, getting married, and just generally growing up happy and loved, and then receives that love back when on his deathbed. The idea at its core here has the potential to be a great ending. Jack and the little sisters both are people exploited down to their very genetic core by the powers above them, who would abuse them for their own gain. Even before he was born, Jack was kidnapped and forced to submit to Fontaine's every command, and the little sisters were either orphaned or kidnapped from their own families and experimented on by Suchong, one of the most amoral characters in the city. What they share in common is a childhood lost. They were stolen from their real families to fit the needs of an uncaring society. Jack becoming a sort of pseudo-father figure to the girls could have been exactly what Bioshock needed to get some emotion from players at the end, but it's the artificial brevity and the way too exaggerated tone that once again make the ending look way more stupid than it had to be. There's not even a neutral ending or any kind of middle ground. Whether you become C. Hitler or Father Teresa is entirely dependent on if you harvest more than 1 little sister. Bioshock's ending is notoriously lackluster for how it so badly botched the concept of moral choice. It doesn't offer enough nuance in its systems or its writing to make Moral Choice a compelling addition to the game. Bioshock has widely garnered the reputation of being a masterpiece and one of the best games of the 7th generation. I only agree with the second part of that. It is a deeply flawed, sometimes unbearably clunky in its systems, sometimes unbearably stupid and misguided in its writing, but ultimately genius, defiantly unique game that has no true equal. Even its own sequels, although more refined in their systems and mechanics, piggyback off the wildly creative energy and spirit of Irrational's work on this game. Bioshock marked a point in history when a cutting-edge game treated themes as complicated as politics, science, and morality seriously, and sometimes with real depth and nuance. There had been plenty of games before that have tackled similar subjects, but never in the console-dominated AAA space. That only happens once every few years, and I'd argue that it still hasn't been topped by a single game in every aspect. Witcher 3 does morality a lot better, Deus Ex does science a lot better, and so on, but there hasn't been one game to do every aspect better. This is one of the few games that I'll still want to play when I'm close to returning to Dust. It transcends its own gameplay flaws and becomes something particularly rare and meaningful. It becomes true video game art. You can't tell a story like this in another medium, non-linearly, through audio logs and environmental details, and you can't create a world with this much detail without huge walls of text or exposition dumps in a book or a movie. Bioshock isn't a perfect game, but it is a perfectly constructed world, and that is something much more uniquely valuable for video games. I'm 24 years old now, and while Halo 2 and Call of Duty 2 sit buried in a box somewhere back at my parents' house, I own 4 different copies of Bioshock and play it at least once a year. If somebody asked me what my favorite game was today, there's no question Bioshock would be in the running.